proposition, does God exist? If he does, show me how. Show me why.
Well, I think there are a number of good reasons to think that God exists. In the debates that I've been having here in Canada, I typically present 5 reasons and then defend them in greater detail. God is the best explanation for the origin of the universe. God is the best explanation of the fine-tuning of the universe for intelligent life. God is the best explanation for the existence of objective moral values in the world. God is the best explanation for the historical facts concerning the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth, and God can be immediately known and experienced. And on that basis, I think it's rational to conclude that God exists.
There are no alternative explanations as to why we exist, how we exist, and how the world began?
Certainly there are alternative explanations, and I don't mean to suggest that atheism is irrational or anything of that sort, but I'm suggesting that the best explanation, the more plausible one, is the one that I defend.
Where does evolution come into all this?
It doesn't come into any of the arguments that I present, because the second argument I give, the design argument, doesn't concern the origin of biological complexity. It concerns the remarkable fine-tuning of the initial conditions of the universe given in the Big Bang that scientists have only begun to discover within the last 40 years or so. So that for biological evolution to take place anywhere in the universe, you have to have this elaborately set table in advance in the initial conditions of the Big Bang that cries out for some sort of explanation.
How old is the world?
Best estimates today are around 13.7 billion years or so.
Now, this is good, you see. This is a position I can embrace, because there are people who will sit here and say, no, it's 6,500 years old. That is not a tenable position?
I don't think it's plausible. The arguments that I give are right in line with mainstream science. I'm not bucking up against mainstream science in presenting these arguments. Rather, I'm going with the flow of what contemporary cosmology and astrophysics supports.
Is there a contradiction or an inconsistency between the biblical account of the age of the Earth and your statement?
Well, that's interesting, because there isn't any biblical account of the age of the Earth. There's nothing in the Genesis or elsewhere in the Bible that says how old the universe is. So, no, I don't think it is incompatible.
We often hear that the rather caricatured argument that Christians believe that man and dinosaur coexisted.
There are some creationists, they typically style themselves young Earth creationists, who believe that. I've even seen children's books where Noah takes dinosaur eggs on the ark with him. Well, all of this is reading between the lines. There's nothing like that in the book of Genesis.
Forgive these questions. In a perfect world, I wouldn't have to ask them, but if God is all good and all-powerful and all-knowing, why does he allow bad things to happen to good people?
This is, I think, the principal argument for the atheistic side that my opponents in the debates will sometimes bring up. And I think that there's a couple of ways to respond to this. First, we need to understand what the atheist is claiming here. Is he arguing that God and suffering are logically incompatible with each other? If he is, then he needs to show that there's some sort of implicit contradiction there, because there's no explicit contradiction. And I would say that no atheist has ever been able to sustain that burden of proof, to show that there are necessarily true assumptions that would reveal some kind of a contradiction between God and the suffering and evil in the world. In fact, I think we can prove that they are compatible by just adding a third proposition, and that would be that God has morally sufficient reasons for permitting the evil and suffering in the world. As long as that's even possible, it shows that God and evil are logically compatible. So that logical version of the argument doesn't work. Now, very quickly, there's a probabilistic version of the argument which says, all right, God and evil are logically compatible, but nevertheless it's highly improbable that God exists, given the evil and suffering in the world. And I think there's a number of moves that the theist can make in response to that argument to show that it's not improbable that God exists, given the suffering in the world.
I happen to believe, and I'm trying to be as objective as I can throughout the debate, that the reasons why there is suffering and pain are entirely obvious, and in fact they're inevitable if there is a loving God. But how would you explain them? Why then does God have to allow discomfort, suffering, pain, terrible pain sometimes to exist?
Well, I would say, Michael, that there isn't any single reason rather, there's a multitude of reasons that would be in play here. One would be that God wants to create a world of free creatures who can become responsible moral agents and mature persons. And that will require a world that operates according to certain natural laws, where the fire that warms you can also burn you, the water that sustains you can drown you. And it would require the ability of these creatures to do morally evil acts. And so creating that sort of an arena, I think, is going to allow the possibility of natural suffering and moral evil to occur. But that God permits these with the overall goal in mind of bringing people freely into a knowledge of himself and to eternal salvation. And the goal of human life is not happiness in this life. We are not God's pets. His goal is not to create a nice terrarium here for his human pets. Rather, it is to bring persons into communion with himself forever, freely. And in order to do that, it's not at all implausible that a world suffused with natural and moral evil would be the correlative of that.
Okay.